despite having almost all the media in their corner, despite having all the academics in their corner and all the good, beautiful people in their corner and the actors and singers, they're still in the minority. And we proved that on election day.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today, we have an important conversation with JNS columnist Ruthie Blum about the battle over judicial reform in Israel. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. To anyone who follows the news from Israel via corporate liberal media outlets like the New York Times or the broadcast networks, or even most Jewish publications, what's going on in the Jewish state is nothing less than an epic battle to save democracy from being subverted by ruthless authoritarians. According to this narrative, the government, given a clear majority in the Knesset only 4 months ago in a democratic election, is bent not on reforming an out-of-control and unaccountable judiciary, but on ending the country's democratic system by a regime coup that will, if they get their way, not only wipe out all protections for Israeli minorities, wage a culture war in which the secular and liberal sectors of society are oppressed by the religious minority. The expectation is that judicial reform will mean that future elections will be canceled as Netanyahu installs himself as a permanent dictator of an illiberal state that will bear little resemblance to the Israel that we know. Wow, that's a pretty scary scenario, and if it were true, it might justify the fact that throngs of hundreds of thousands that have taken to Israel's streets to demonstrate against the government and judicial reform, as well as those who have blocked highways, pulled their money out of Israeli banks, and threatened not to do reserve duty with the army. If the end of democracy was truly a possibility, then just about anything might be imaginable to save it. But the problem with this narrative is that it is completely false. Judicial reform is necessary in a country with a high court that is allowed to decide cases merely on the basis of what judges think is reasonable rather than on the basis of law, where the same judges can pick their successors, ensuring that change is impossible. The fact that the court acts not only without any check on its powers, but as an active political force that refuses to allow the political right to govern when it wins elections and lets the left do as it likes when it wins, is telling. At stake in this debate is not democracy, but whether the losers in the last election can get away with refusing to accept the results. As with the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump in 2016 as President of the United States, the opposition has formed a resistance that is determined to topple the winners by any means, fair or foul. And they have the formidable support of elites of legal, media, and economic and academic establishments behind them, as well as backing from foreign governments like the United States that want a more pliable prime minister of Israel than Benjamin Netanyahu. If there is a coup being planned, it is the one that the political left is attempting to execute, not the government that just won an election. The effort is pure projection, since their goal is to undermine democracy and preserve what is, in effect, a juristocracy, that exists to thwart democracy rather than defend it. Judicial reform would make Israel's governing system more democratic, not less. And that is exactly what its opponents don't like about it, since they think their right wing and religious opponents ought not to be allowed to govern, even when they win. That the fight for democracy is really about an undemocratic desire to foil the will of the voters is obvious to those not blinded by hatred for Netanyahu and his right wing and religious supporters. But you'd never know about any of that if all you know about Israel is from the New York Times and left wing Jewish publications. What those outlets are reluctant to discuss is the way this panic about the country's future is being fueled not so much by constitutional arguments as it is by societal conflicts. The animus of the demonstrators is not so much about any possible changes in the court system as it is their perception that more democracy will give nationalists, and especially religious voters, more of a say in how the country is run. This is a culture war as much as it is a political one. It is far from clear how this will turn out, as the courts may well seek to overturn laws passed by the Knesset on no other basis but a desire to defend their power from any limits. And there's no telling where the demonstrations will end, as some participants have threatened to turn violent if they don't get their way. Just as important, those who believe there are no limits to the extent to which they'll go to tear down Israel in order to topple Netanyahu also seem uninterested in the fact that their smears of the government as authoritarian and undemocratic are providing ammunition to those forces who want to destroy Israel, whether it is run by the left or the right. Now, to break all this down, to tell us where this crisis is heading, we're very fortunate to welcome back to Top Story one of my favorite writers and people, and one of the outstanding voices of sanity and intelligence in Israeli journalism. Ruthie Blum is a columnist with the Jewish News Syndicate and the Jerusalem Post. A longtime editor and writer for various publications, she is also a regular commentator on life in Israel and the United States, U.S.-Israel relations, and author of the 2012 book To Hell in a Handbasket, Carter, Obama, and the Arab Spring. Originally from New York City, she moved to Israel in 1977 and currently resides in Tel Aviv. Ruthie Blum, welcome back to Top Story.
So happy to be here again, Jonathan.
Well, Ruthie, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you, before we get into the background of the fight over judicial reform in Israel, to tell us where the situation stands now in the Knesset, in the streets, and in the courts. And does Netanyahu's government have the votes to actually enact judicial reform? And then what happens then?
Oh, well, at the moment, Likud, which is Netanyahu's party and the biggest party in the Knesset, has decided unilaterally to soften the reforms in order to calm down the streets and the hysteria that's going on. Now, it won't really work, but that's another story. What's going on right now is that some of the reforms are in the process of first readings, second readings, third readings, etc., in the Knesset, after having been discussed in the Knesset Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee. And the hysteria in the streets is about stopping these reforms altogether. And I'll get into that in a minute about whether it's really about that. Okay. Ostensibly, it's about that. So the anti-reform people are saying, stop them all because you're leading us to a dictatorship. And the pro-reform camp is saying, no, at the moment we have a dictatorship of the bench. And we are going to rectify a situation that has been terrible for the last 30 years. So that's the ostensible battle going on. Now, at the moment...
But it's really not about that, is it?
No, it is absolutely not about that. But, and how we know that? We know that because of what the leaders of the demonstrations are saying. Okay. Now, this isn't true of every single person. Okay. There are actually some pundits, very few, and some politicians who are saying, okay, let's try to reach a compromise that it calms this whole appearance of civil war. Let's calm things down. Let's take a breath and let's discuss this. But it basically, the trouble is that Likud members, many Likud members and voters, are disappointed in Justice Minister Yariv Levin and in Knesset member Simcha Rothman, who is one of the architects of these reforms, disappointed that they're willing now to soften these without for no reason, and mainly because they say, and it won't help anyway, because that's not what these demonstrations are about. So that's where we stand right now, and so we'll see what happens in Likud. Also, there's a question about whether, even with this new softened legislation, if the Supreme Court doesn't decide to knock it down, to strike it down. And we have this kind
to protect
of
their power, yeah.
Reject, and the trouble is that we have this vicious cycle. Precisely the reason that reforms are needed are exactly, it's going in a circle, because the Supreme Court is saying, okay, well, this is going to be a dictatorship, so we won't allow it. And you have half the public, including some people in the army, you have economists from every sector saying, well, if it comes to that, and this is the word they use, they say, we won't obey the government, we'll obey the law. Okay, now this is ridiculous, because most of the laws on the books already say that, for example, the army is beholden to the government, not to the court. It is the law. It's not either the government or the law. You see, there's insanity going on here that is really that's really beyond anything we've seen, I don't know, in decades.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, these two sides are in a sense talking past each other. And it's a question of what is the government's goal. If you listen to the opposition, you read for our readers, or, and listeners and viewers, who see the coverage of this in the New York Times, as well as in Haaretz and the Times of Israel and the Jerusalem Post, they are, sort of getting this message that Netanyahu really wants to end democracy. And the question is, how does the opposition get away with saying that? And why are they saying that? Since, this is, in a sense, it's in some ways an almost arcane battle about the Constitution, but it's not really. That's not what's driving people to the streets, is it?
No, it absolutely isn't what's driving them to the streets. In fact, many of the leaders of the anti-protest movement and the leader of the opposition himself, Yair Lapid, who is really a secondary player in this whole thing. The protesters are not listening to him. There's a very well-oiled, organized machine, and Yair Lapid is kind of catching up to it. He's not leading it. But he is the leader of the opposition, and he has said many outrageous things, like this is the end of democracy. And Benny Gantz, who is the head of the third largest party, Yair Lapid is the head of the second largest party, and Benny Gantz is the head of the third largest. He actually said before the elections that if the outcome is this, a right-wing government, then we can kiss the country goodbye. It'll be the end of the country. He didn't even say the end of democracy. So now I happen to think that not one of the leaders of these protests actually believes this propaganda, because, if you talk to Israelis, they say it'll be a dictatorship and all that. Do they really believe it? I find that so hard to believe that they believe it. And the closest thing Israel came to a dictatorship was the very beginning of the state, when David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, basically dictated everything. And you don't hear these people attacking him for that. But in any case, this isn't what Netanyahu is trying to do. Now, just to give you an example of how extremely ludicrous this is, Netanyahu is forbidden from discussing judicial reform with anybody. So he can't get up and address the nation and explain what he's doing. Why? Because the Attorney General decided that he's not allowed to do it. And she decided that just because she can. And this is another example of why this reform is needed. We need to separate the job of the role of the attorney general into being is going to be the lawyer of the government and the prosecutor of the government and the boss of the government. This is unacceptable.
Yeah, this is very different from, an attorney general of the United States, the attorney general in the United States is, a member of, in this case here right now, Merrick Garland is, an aide to and, sort of a weapon of the Biden administration, as the attorney general was under Trump and every other administration in the past. In Israel, the attorney general is sort of the judge, jury, and prosecutor stands
Absolutely.
outside of the government and acts to basically hamstring the government whenever they feel like it.
Exactly. Now imagine you hired a lawyer. Okay, you hired a lawyer for whatever reason. It could be, the sale of an apartment, a divorce, or whatever, a criminal case. And the lawyer said to you, you can't do this. Or you said, I want to take the stand. And your lawyer said, you really shouldn't do that. You could say, look, I'm going to do it. All right. I heard your advice. I'm doing it anyway. And in the end, you could also fire your lawyer if you thought that he wasn't serving you properly. Right. Here you have this legal body person who is not answerable to the government. It's the other way around. And the prime minister has to take her orders. It's insane, and it should be corrected.
Right, and there are lesser, there is a legal advisor to each ministry in the Israeli government that
Exactly.
has the same kind of power.
And they're the arms. It's like an octopus where the attorney general is the key, as you said, lawyer, prosecutor, judge, whatever. And all the attorneys general, the smaller ones in each ministry, is kind of a branch of that office. And it's almost like having little spies in each of the ministries.
Well, it's
Now
also what we call in the United States an administrative state, where the bureaucracy rules the politicians.
that's right.
For those who remember the old British show Yes Minister, which was
Yes,
sort of true but also funny, where
that's right.
the politician who held the job didn't really exercise the power. It was Sir Humphrey Applegate, the quintessential bureaucrat who actually wielded the power while the politician pretended to. In Israel, that system is basically there on steroids. And that's what this government wants to change. It wants to put the power back in the hands of the voters, right? And who the
That's right.
voters
Or to
choose.
at least have a balance of power among the three branches of government, the judiciary and the legislature and the executive. Now, the demonstrators are claiming that actually all this is doing is putting all three branches, the power of all three, in the hands of the right. This is not true, and it's propaganda that in some cases it's purposely spread. In other cases, I think people who don't know enough about it are frightened into believing it. And to make matters worse, the 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 protesters themselves, when interviewed, very often they have no clue about the reforms, because when they're asked things like, which clause of the reform are you opposed to? Usually these man and woman in the street interviews end by the person saying, the details don't matter. I don't know, whatever. The whole thing is bad because we're going to be a dictatorship and women will have no rights. They actually say things like this. And there will be no gay rights. And anyway, the state is going to become a theocratic fascist state. You say, what? Where is that written? Where do you see it? They're being irrational, and you know,
Well, in a sense, irrational. You're right, but when you say what's motivating them, it's clear it's not the as you've just shown, it's not the details. They just don't like this government. They don't want this government to rule. They fear that that the religious voters who help make up about a quarter of the Israeli electorate, and obviously, about half the votes that put Benjamin Netanyahu into power, have, they don't want them to have any power. They don't want the verdict of democracy, which gave the right and religious voters a say in the government, and control, at least temporarily, until the next election. They think that's illegitimate. And it's not like they don't want a prime minister to have power. They just don't like this prime minister and this government.
No, absolutely. And, I don't know whether our listeners, viewers, hate or love Donald Trump. I would like to quote something he said today or yesterday when he was talking about the fact that perhaps today he's going to be arrested. He said, "They're not coming after me, they're coming after you." The reason I wanted to quote that is that this is also what's happening in these demonstrations and in all the articles against the reforms. The claims are that the voters of these parties are to blame, and that we are bad and we are fascists and we are low class, we don't pay taxes, we don't serve in the army. There's this sort of general attack on not only on the politicians in these parties, but on the public. And it is personally offensive to me. It's one thing when you go after a politician. Okay, we're used to hearing all these crazy accusations against Netanyahu, but it's Netanyahu's voters who are under assault as well, and not just religious people. And you hear this all the time. So, in that sense, when Trump said that, I identified with that, regardless of whether Trump is right or wrong about whether he's going to be arrested or whether he should be. Okay, that's a whole separate issue.
Yeah, but I think you're really getting to the heart of this now. Now, just sort of back up for a second, just to sort of make the point that this isn't so much about judicial reform. What has opposition leader Yair Lapid's stance on the issue of judicial reform been in the past, and what have other people in the opposition said about the power of the court? When it wasn't a question of whether Netanyahu would enact these reforms.
Well, in fact, in 2014, Yair Lapid made a statement so attacking the courts and that the system is terrible and undemocratic outright, and that it has to be reformed. Okay. Now, not only that, Gidon Sar, who was a justice minister in the previous government and who is a member of Benny Gantz's party, he was a key judicial reform guy. And now he's going against this government. It's anything a Netanyahu-led government does is evil. To make it worse, it's a Netanyahu-led government that has no left-wing parties in it, and also has, heaven forbid, religious people, settlers, Haredim, all. It's like and so what you have now is you have thousands of women wearing Handmaid's Tale costumes, marching in perfect military form in these demonstrations. And may I add, not only do those costumes cost a lot of money, and believe me, the individual demonstrators are not paying for that, but a Likud member discovered by playing dumb that if you volunteer to wear one of those costumes, you get paid 1,200 shekels. Now, we can carry, that's about $350 or something. I mean, I can't do the math right now, and especially not with the dollar shekel exchange rate changing every minute. But you get the picture. And truck drivers are being paid money to block roads during demonstrations. And not only that, but the names on Thursdays, they've been taking to doing once every Saturday night there are demonstrations, but in the middle of the week, or usually on a Thursday, they have a day of disruption, a day of resistance, and then it's a day of paralysis. They call it a name. And of course, I may point out that normal people who have jobs, and I don't mean like professors who don't work all that hard anyway, professors and students and all kinds of people out in the streets all day. The rest of us who have actual jobs, many employers say, okay, everybody work from home because on Thursday there's going to be a day of disruption and you won't be able to get to work. So everybody work from home. Real people who have real jobs are not out acting like it's Woodstock.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a certain amount of theater involved in this,
Much
but
theater.
the hysteria, though. I mean, we explained the issue of how the Attorney General and the Department of Legal Advisors work and how that undermines democracy. But at the end, this is really a cultural war, isn't it? Pitting secular liberal
And
elites who vote for
class.
the parties of the
Class.
left and against working class and religious voters who vote for the right. I mean, isn't that basically what this boils down to?
It really is, though they deny it, because one of the issues that has been raised again from the right during these demonstrations is that it's also kind of racist against anybody who's Mizrahi or Ethiopian or anything like that. It's and it is definitely a class struggle. It's not just, it is a culture war, that's for sure. But it's not only a culture war, it's class. And an interesting factor in all of this is that the army units that are absolutely not demonstrating and not threatening not to serve are all infantry. They're all the units where you tend to have more Mizrahim and religious people. The Ashkenazim with the highest, matriculation scores, and who are the cream of the crop of society, like pilots. They're a kind of homogeneous bunch, and they're the ones doing all the threatening. Now, interestingly, why is this interesting? It's because one of the issues of having a more diverse Supreme Court goes back to this very issue, that one of the reasons that you don't have more Mizrahim in the elite units, they are in elite combat units, but not as pilots, and they tend not to be in the technological intelligence units, is precisely because, let's say, where they come from, they don't have as good education, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a vicious cycle because Justice Aaron Barak, the former Supreme Court president, who basically is responsible for the power grab that put us in the situation that we're in right now, gave an interview about 3 weeks ago in which he openly said, he said two pretty horrifying things. Not pretty horrifying. One was, he said, it's true that we wanted to have, let's say, a Moroccan on the Supreme Court, but we couldn't find one, he said. The second thing he said that really showed the divide in the country is that this expert in jurisprudence, never bothered to learn anything about Jewish law. Now that's pretty astounding. Okay, you don't have to be religious, but you would think that someone who claims also to be an expert in American law and Canadian law and French law, since he was sitting there talking about no other democracy in the world has this or that or the other thing, never bothered to study Jewish law. And those two things really sort of tell you what you need to know. And not only that, they also explain the results of this election, because with each passing year and with each passing government, the disenfranchised, and I include myself among those, because though I am not from, let's say, a poor family or anything like that, but am always under assault for my political views, uh, have become so angry and so sick of this kind of elite the elite group that thinks it has dibs on what Israel is without knowing anything really about Zionism or Judaism or anything like that. So, and then you end up with an election that the results of which said, we don't want left wingers in our government. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very astonishing to me, and I think we could name names of people that we know who are sort of prominent writers, whether they were so much right wingers or not, but were sort of sensible people, and but because they are among the sort of the educated elites in Israel, they are, they are appalled by the idea of a right wing government, and of, the religious, the growth of the religious sector, and they are sort of waging, war on the, on this government because they feel that if this government is allowed to survive or succeed, that while they say it's the end of democracy, what they mean is that their views will not prevail, that if the views of right-wing nationalists or religious voters prevail, that they won't feel at home in Israel anymore. I'll just, someone like Daniel Gordis, somebody I've always really respected as a scholar, he posted a picture on Facebook which led to a lot of angry responses, where he took a picture. He was getting on a plane to go to the United States, and he took a picture of a lot of ultra Orthodox Jews who were also getting on the plane. He's like, that's the future of the country, basically. If Netanyahu succeeds, so
And excuse
it's sort
me,
of like,
if
where's
anybody else had said that, Jonathan, in any other part of the
yes,
world, we would have screamed anti-Semitism, and we would be right to. And therefore, I say
exactly.
that this kind of anti-Semitism is no different. I do not give Daniel Gordis a pass because he's a rabbi who doesn't like Haredi rabbis or the ultra-Orthodox. I'm sorry. It was an anti-Semitic photo and remark.
Right. And, we get people, other, people sort of that we always thought of as being, leading people. Martin Kramer, another leading scholar, he's trolling me on Twitter claiming that there is no such thing as class. And if I'm claiming that it's class, I'm a Marxist, which is, pretty funny, but it's sort of like, those are the, they're twisting themselves into pretzels in order basically to justify, the fact that, the outcomes of elections shouldn't be allowed to prevail.
Exactly. And by the way, speaking of Martin Kramer, he used to troll me on Facebook long before this election and attack me for any of my defenses of Netanyahu. And this I'm talking about in the last few years until he finally stopped or blocked me or something. Um, so just so we get this straight, to pretend now that suddenly it's because of judicial reform is just so disingenuous at best. Okay. Um, and by the way, it is anybody who is a scholar and a Zionist and somebody who is aware of the culture of Israeli culture that's such a mixture, a beautiful mixture of modern and ancient and religious and secular and all that. This amazing country, those people ought to be ashamed of themselves that they're talking about it as though just because of a certain government, it's all going to be finished. How dare they? By the way, I actually said in a debate a few days ago, in a debate, I said, okay, look, let's say you're all disgruntled. You think this is the end of democracy. Okay, fine. So in 4 years from now, or whenever the next election ends up being held, vote them out, vote your people in. And the answer was, by that time, if these reforms pass, elections will be banned. Now, excuse me, what do you say to people like that? These are educated people. These are people who know better or ought to know better. So I think they're just lying, not that they believe this nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm not even sure how to answer that. I think some of
There
them
is no answer.
actually do believe it.
Really, really? Okay, there's really going to be elections are going to be banned. I mean, seriously. And another thing, Why do they assume that it's an interesting thing that they assume that the people, the electorate, that's the majority now, and you should take into account that 5 minutes practically after this election, the signs that went up, and they were actually paid for by the newspaper Haaretz. It was an ad campaign to put on buildings and bus stops, billboard like that, billboards that said, democracy doesn't end with elections. So that was before we got into the whole debate about judicial reform. It was already like, don't think that because you're a majority, that that's a democratic process. I mean,
Yeah,
excuse me?
it's clearly, they're a resistance. They're not an
Right.
opposition.
And then they
And,
have the
you know,
nerve to say Hitler was elected just that way through democratic elections. And if one more person brings up Hitler, I'm going to tear my hair out over this.
well,
You know,
I keep your hair on. I think you'll hear it plenty of times, unfortunately.
I may end up
But
bald.
I think this does boil down to, this sort of hysteria where they have actually convinced themselves, just as many in the United States convinced themselves that Trump was an authoritarian. And now they're in the process of convincing themselves that Governor DeSantis of Florida, will be an authoritarian if he wins next year, which is, of course, a leap
Yeah.
of faith on both sides. But I guess the question I want to ask next is, let's talk about some of these attempts to disrupt the country, disrupt the economy, pulling money out of the economy. As you say, reserve pilots saying refusing to do duty. Where does that leave the country? I mean, it's kind of like either they have to get their way or they're really willing to tear the country apart. I mean, I don't know about civil war, but I believe, they think that if they can't win, if they can't overturn this election, and I think part of it is also sort of, a pessimism. They know demographically, the left is losing. The religious sector is growing demographically. The parties of the left are a shadow of themselves. That they don't actually, they may, whether they believe that elections will be banned in 4 years, they don't have much confidence that they can win another election, at least under the current circumstances.
Right. And by the way, they blame demography for this. In other words, religious people have lots of babies. But let me just tell you something. In Israel, secular people have lots of babies too, number one. Number two, it's not only the religious who have rejected the left. Let's be clear on this. Many secular people got disillusioned with their fantasies about a two-state solution, peace with the Palestinians. What they did, they came to realize that Netanyahu was right all along about making that Iran is the enemy, and making peace with the other Arab neighbors. It's what he's been saying for many, many, many years, that the Palestinians are not necessary for peace in the region. He proved himself to be right. The Palestinians proved themselves to want to destroy Israel. This is not only a demographic issue with religious people. That's another lie that the left is trying to spread. It's all because the religious people have lots of
Well,
babies.
the rhetoric about not paying taxes and not serving in the
That's a big
army,
lie too.
which most religious people actually do. I mean, the
Yes,
Haredim, a
yes.
small percentage do,
And
but
by the
but
way,
it's more than that.
I know that they're full of it, because let me tell you, and also about serving in the army. You know how many left-wing people don't serve in the army? No, you don't know. Because all of my friends, I have many friends whose sons did not serve in the army. It is much easier today to tell the IDF, I can't serve for this reason or another. I'm too delicate. I'll be depressed. I hate the army, whatever it is. Okay. You don't even have to be a conscientious objector anymore, because the army really doesn't want soldiers who don't want to serve. And the army doesn't want a whole bunch of Haredim in the army where they have to make sure the food is ultra kosher. They really don't. It's hard for the army. But there are many Haredim who serve in the army. That's another lie, that they don't serve at all. the point is that this business of it, they don't pay taxes. It's like in America when they say the rich, don't pay taxes and the poor pay taxes. It's nonsense. But I will say one thing that I hate to, you don't want to laugh about this. But when the whole hysteria about the economy is going to crash, even though, by the way, there was nothing to suggest that the economy was going to crash except people saying it was going to. All right. And so a couple of high-tech firms, unicorns, said, take your money out. We got to take our money out and put it elsewhere and put it elsewhere. And so a few companies put their money in the Silicon Valley Bank, and boom, it crashed the next day. So you know what? I don't anticipate so many more high-tech companies doing that. All right.
No, I don't think
All
so.
right. That's what
There's
happened to
certainly
those
some
people.
poetic justice
Yes.
to that story.
Yes.
But I
And
guess,
then,
the banks are one thing, but I guess anybody who, knows anything about Israeli culture, the threats to refuse military service really cuts to the heart of the sort of the country's national ethos. How is
it
that
really
playing
does.
out?
Well, it is appalling to most people. It is appalling. And the trouble is that the defense minister, who is actually a Likud guy, and he has threatened to resign if there isn't a serious compromise or a halt or a pause in the reforms. Yoav Gallant is his name. He was freaked out by this because, what are we going to do? There's this phenomenon, okay? But let me tell you something. As many people have, writers and politicians have pointed out that the whole country will suffer from this attitude, because imagine if the left, when they want to, let's say, at some point in the imaginary point in the future, the government decides to withdraw to the 1967 borders, much to the delight of the left, and all the right-wing soldiers say, okay, we're not going to serve in the army. Imagine. We can't have that. We cannot have it. And we didn't have it during the disengagement, and we didn't have it during the Oslo Accords. When the left is in power, the right gets mad, has a few demonstrations, poorly funded, poorly organized. It does not do this. This is an assault on the country. And anybody who sees it otherwise is kidding himself or lying.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you've reminded me of, what happened after, in the demonstrations against Oslo and against the Gaza withdrawal. In those cases, as you say, those much more poorly organized and funded demonstrations did try to block the roads, and they did various things. Those demonstrators, many of them were locked up. I mean, in the case of the Oslo, I know there were people who were charged and convicted of sedition because they dissented. And the Supreme Court, which is supposedly the defender of the rights of minorities and of dissent, did nothing. They were
Absolutely.
fine with that. It just exposed the
Absolutely.
hypocrisy.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you another interesting thing, and this is something maybe many people have forgotten. When Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Yigal Amir at a demonstration, a peace love demonstration, celebrating, okay, now we have peace, Oslo, etc. He was assassinated, and the entire country, and I mean left, right, and center, everybody went into serious mourning. This was horrifying to have our prime minister assassinated. And the left said, you see, the whole right is to blame. It's all your fault. And Netanyahu was inciting. They accused us of assassinating Rabin. And the right said, we all have to do soul searching. And soul searching and soul searching. The whole country was talking about soul searching. All right. And guess who won the election a few months later? Not Shimon Peres, who had been Rabin's, actually in the Labor Party, but he was actually Rabin's nemesis. Shimon Peres was up against Bibi Netanyahu, and Netanyahu won that election. And it was kind of not only kind of a shock, it was a huge shock, because after all, the right assassinated Rabin. But that's the key here. If you blame innocent people who are good Zionists and good people for doing something that a criminal who is now spending his life in the rest of his life in jail, you had the opposite effect happened. It didn't cause the left to win.
Mhm. Well,
You know,
that's the interesting question, and of course, right now in the past few weeks, we've had lots of incitement from the left, threats of violence against
and
the
that's
government,
okay,
against
and
Netanyahu.
that's legal. That's legal. Nobody's telling them to do soul searching. Yep,
Yeah.
that's right.
Well,
That's right.
I guess the next step to ask is, can the Supreme Court refuse to accept the laws passed by the Knesset? If judicial reform, is passed, where will that leave the country? I mean, I don't know I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure you do, but what would happen then?
I don't, but at this particular moment, the only issue that's being discussed is whether the Supreme Court will strike down the watered down reform, one part of it, which is the committee for the judicial appointment committee, is how you call it in English, the judicial appointment committee, the makeup of it and how it is and how judges are appointed. And that was severely watered down, as I said in the very beginning, in order to calm everybody's nerves and all that. Um, and some legal experts are saying, even not right wingers, I mean, are saying that the Supreme Court really could not strike it down because there's nothing in there to justify that. But we'll see, because you're talking about some very bad players here in our Supreme Court, very bad, and ill intention. So I don't know. And what I'm hoping, I can tell you what I'm hoping. I can't tell you what's going to happen. I don't believe that Israelis are going to start shooting each other in the streets like an actual civil war. Nor do I believe that Israelis are all going to take their money out of the country. Nor do I believe the hype that Israelis in droves are emigrating. Okay, other than those who wanted to anyway. um, what I'm hoping is that if that the voters will not lose, that we won't lose our nerve in the face of this onslaught, because this onslaught, excuse me, because it is reminiscent of the Palestinian playbook of of uh, delegitimization, to the point of Israel, to the point that the international community says, you see, Israel is evil. And then Israelis begin to say, well, maybe we can do something to make it look better. Maybe we'll throw a bone, we'll do this, we'll do that. That's a mistake. It hasn't worked. And I'm just hoping that that's not what's about to happen here. Because for one thing, it doesn't work because the demonstrators aren't demonstrating against judicial reform. So even if we soften this and soften that and don't do that, it won't work. Um, and all it'll do is get the right wing base angry, and that could actually topple the government. And then the left will have won just by the virtue of putting a wedge, jamming a wedge inside the ruling coalition.
Well, Ruthie, I guess the question I have to ask next is, everybody talks about wanting compromise, sort of to calm the waters. What actually is a compromise? You mentioned the Judicial Appointments Committee, which is basically this crazy system where the judges de facto get to name their successors, and obviously the left, the people who oppose Netanyahu, want to preserve that. Is there a way to for the government to sort of stick this out and fight to get their way in the face of these apocalyptic threats without sacrificing the whole point that they're trying to establish?
Well, yes, there is a way. There at the moment, there's a kind of let's say argument going on within the government about what constitutes the necessary, what are the necessary steps and what are the ones that can be put on the back burner or eliminated because, for example, if you take care of a couple of these things, for example, if you talk about the override clause that some people have been talking about, we haven't heard about that for a while. The override clause has to do with what is required if the Supreme Court ends up knocking down a Knesset legislation, and then the Knesset can, if it has a majority, can override the Supreme Court decision. This is one of the most, let's say, divisive issues in the that's been spoken of. But it's possible that if you have the Judicial Selection Committee rearranged and you have the Attorney General's role shifted, that you won't need the override clause so much. That's what I'm saying. I'm not a legal expert, so I don't want to be the person who's going to go through clause by clause. But what I mean is there are certain things that if they go through, the others are less crucial. And
Yeah, I think
so,
that makes sense,
yes.
but I can't really, I don't really imagine that sort of the op-ed writers at Haaretz or the people that are inciting these demonstrations are going to be satisfied even with that,
Oh,
because
no,
that
they're
will
not.
still leave Netanyahu in place.
No, no. And by the way, you should know that even if tomorrow Netanyahu announced, or had somebody else announce in his place, since he's not allowed to talk about this, announced that we were canceling all judicial reforms, these demonstrations will not stop, because the demonstrations, in the demonstrations, what you have is that Netanyahu is a criminal, and the whole government and the Haredim are criminals, and everybody's, and we have to get rid of this government. So, that's always the trouble with appeasement. That's why I mentioned the Palestinians. Um, that's what they do too. They say, okay, we want this. Okay, fine, you can have that. No, we want this now. Now, and this, and this. And then when Ehud Barak at Camp David offered Arafat practically the whole country, that sparked the suicide bombing war. It didn't spark peace. So, the you could say it's not a good analogy, because we're talking about external enemies versus internecine strife. But what's applicable here is the upping the ante, or also what's applicable is, since the Palestinian issue really wasn't a real estate one, it wasn't about, okay, we need these territories and those territories and this, that it wasn't about that. It was about destroying the state of Israel. In this case, it's about destroying the government. And
And making sure
unfortunately,
that the right and the religious can't rule. Yeah.
exactly, and Netanyahu in particular. But here's another hilarious, or tragic, hilarious and tragic simultaneously. Here is another thing that they don't even notice when they're contradicting themselves on the left. They all used to say, on the left and in what they call the center, that if only Netanyahu would step down as head of Likud, then everything would be great. Why? Because someone else would head the Likud, who would then be great. He would make compromises. There would be a national unity government or something along those lines. Okay. Now, how do we know that's a big lie? Because today, who is the second most popular member of Likud after Netanyahu, judging by the primaries, the Likud primaries? Yariv Levin, who is our justice minister, who is now being attacked as a Nazi and all that. So the point I'm making is, that was false. That if only Netanyahu were to step down, and who else? And if you name to any of the people, as you said, had haaretz, or in the streets of the protests, okay, fine. Let's say Netanyahu. Netanyahu says, "Okay, I'm going off now to go on the lecture circuit. Go ahead." And Likud, who in Likud would you want as head of Likud and prime minister of Israel? Yariv Levin? Oh, no, 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 no. He's dangerous. The next one, Amir Ohana. No, if you name them, so that was another big lie exposed.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, there's a double irony here, because some of the people leading some of the opposition are sort of ex-Likudniks, ex-Likud allies like Gidon Sar, whom you mentioned already, or Avigdor Lieberman, who were just inciting all the time against Netanyahu. But if they had prevailed, if Gidon Sar had beaten Netanyahu in the primary, a laughable thought, but had he done so, he would be the one being called the Nazi right now.
He for sure would have been. And the reason is that he was extremely, you say, conservative on his views on the court, for example. Okay, so I mean, he for
So
sure would have been under that. It's like what you said about Ron DeSantis. It's one thing these people say, no, it's Trump, and and he's crazy, and he's all of those things, all the bad things. Okay, so if DeSantis becomes the head of the Republican Party, that will be his fate. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's a lie. They lie is what they do, or kid themselves. Again, I want to say not everybody's a liar, not everybody's the same. And sadly, I have friends who really, in my opinion, went over to the dark side. And the reason I say they went over to the dark side is not because they disagree with me on judicial reform, and not because they didn't support Likud in the election, but because of the vicious, awful slurs they are making about me, basically. And without saying my name, but about any voter for Likud and about anybody who espouses or supports reforms. And as a result, I call that the dark side, because suddenly to turn on somebody in that vicious a manner, it's just, so it tells you all you need to know. This is not a debate. It's not a debate. It's a culture war, a class war. It's ugly. But the good news is that they are in a minority. Whatever they say it wasn't really a minority, but they're wrong. They're in the minority despite having almost all the media in their corner, despite having all the academics in their corner and all the good, beautiful people in their corner and the actors and singers. They're still in the minority. And we proved that on election day.
Yeah, I think that's true. But let me sort of widen the lens a little bit. As much as Israel is convulsed by this battle, there is a larger battle still going on elsewhere, which is the battle to basically destroy Israel, being waged in international forums and the op-ed columns of the New York Times and elsewhere, and as well as in the terrorism that still continues even as these demonstrations continue. And I wonder, are Netanyahu's critics aware, or do they care about the help that they are providing to Israel's enemies by claiming, by really validating their claims that Israel isn't a democracy, that it's a tyrannical state, and that they're helping the people who want to destroy Israel, whether it is run by the right or the left?
It's not just that they don't care. It's almost as though they're doing it on purpose. If I can give you, two examples. Well, first of all, it's like with the economy. If you say it's going to crash, then your stock goes down, and then you blame Netanyahu, but you were the person creating that situation. Not Netanyahu didn't create it. But another example, and this is a kind of the soldiers, for example. One of the things that these pilots and reservists are saying is that because of the reforms, the international community is now against us, and as a result, we're in danger if we go abroad to be arrested by the International Criminal Court at The Hague for being war criminals. Now, is it really? You're encouraging the international community to hate Israel, and then you're saying you're going to get arrested, as though the International Court at The Hague wasn't already after us. I mean, that's ludicrous. But the most...
Yeah, they didn't care about judicial reform, right? They were
No,
doing this already. Yeah,
exactly. So the really the sort of icing on the cake is Anshel Pfeffer from the Haaretz. He's an Israeli reporter and pundit and author. About a week ago, I'm not sure what day it came out, the Economist from Britain had its cover story say, is Bibi breaking Israel? I think that was its headline. Huge cover story. And in Israel, all the pundits said, look, the Economist is saying Bibi's breaking Israel. Look at that. Even the Economist. But Anshel Pfeffer wrote that article. The Economist,
Yeah.
Haaretz writer, he wrote the cover story. Then Israelis said, look, the Economist is saying it. So,
Well, you and I are both old enough to remember when The Economist was asking whether Menachem Begin was breaking Israel.
oh, absolutely.
In much the same way.
Absolutely. But if The Economist had an Israeli, had a Haaretz writer writing that piece. I mean, so it's like, well, you don't have to point to The Economist to tell us that we know that Anshel Pfeffer thinks that about Netanyahu, you see. He's an Israeli
Right. It
writer.
was just, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, we could have read it in Haaretz anyway.
Exactly.
Well, Ruthie, thanks so much for joining us today, for all your insights on this issue. I want to especially encourage everyone to read Ruthie's biweekly columns at jns.org for the latest on Israeli politics and other issues. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.